On this episode of The Riz Khan Show, I'll meet the British paratrooper turned war artist who's telling the very personal and candid stories of people on the front line in conflicts from Afghanistan to Ukraine.
I am here so that Russia won't come to my home. I want to live in a free country.
Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. As diplomatic efforts to find peace in Ukraine continue to ebb and flow, most media attention focuses on the words of world leaders in Washington, Moscow, Riyadh, Kyiv, and other European capitals. But while a ceasefire proves elusive or perhaps evasive, soldiers and civilians continue to suffer in relative silence. Derek Eland served as an officer in the elite British parachute regiment before jumping, literally, to an entirely different career as an artist. His paintings of the English Lake District are popular, but away from the easel, Derek's fascination with life on the front line continued. And he found a unique way to combine his art with his military experience that would tell the stories of people at the edge of existence, from war zones to Mount Everest. Well, he recently returned from the conflict in Ukraine and joins me now from his home near The Hague in the Netherlands, a place known as the International City of Peace and Justice. Derek, thanks for the time. Now, the parachute regiment, or the paras as they're known, are supposedly some of the toughest in the British Army. So tell me about that journey, from soldier to artist that you went through.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I've always been a painter at school. I painted at university, and I decided to join the army. And I went to Sandhurst, and I went through parachute regiment selection at Sandhurst, which was a rigorous interview. And the chairman of the interview board, he said to me, what did you do in the summer before you came to Sandhurst? And I said, I went to Paris. And he said, what were you doing? I said, I was visiting art galleries. He said, what did you visit? I said, the Tuileries Gardens. Which art did you like? And I thought, this is quite a bizarre interview for the parachute regiment. And I got into that regiment and then discovered that it's quite an erudite mix of people, of writers and artists and poets and the usual warriors. So I kind of fitted in, and I always parachuted with a tin of paints and a sketch pad, and I was in trenches in various places in the UK and other places, drawing and painting, and I think it slightly endeared my soldiers to me. And they were fantastic, and they kind of loved it. And I kind of learned that the parachute regiment accepts all kinds. It likes a bit of creative flair, and it likes a bit of warrior spirit.
When you said you traveled with paints while you were parachuting, I'd be most impressed if you were painting while parachuting, but let's not go there. Now, most people would imagine artists to be there in a studio in front of an easel, not on the front line of a war zone. So how did you get to take your art, your passion for art, to a war zone, to the front line in Afghanistan?
Well, I had a career change. I went to art college about 20 years ago now, and I'd been painting before that. And when I went to art college, I got a residency in my local city in the UK, and I was on top of the tallest building in the city, and I was painting the city from above, a bit like the great German painter Gerhard Richter, who would paint bombed German cities from above after the war. So I was kind of following that, and I'd open up my studio to visitors. People would come up in the lift, have a look at the view, have a look at my work. And I thought, this is going quite well. And one day a woman visited, she came up and said, it's all very well, you painting the city from above, but you have no idea what people in this city think. And she was a campaigner for the preservation of a local Art Deco theatre, 1930s theatre. And I suddenly realized she was right. I was isolated from the real world. So I immediately after that, it was a bit of an epiphany. I decided to ask people whether they loved this particular city, Carlisle in the north of England, and what they would like to change. And I called it Love Carlisle because I thought it wasn't very loved. And I set up a diary room, like a Big Brother diary room in the middle of the city. And I asked people to write on Post-it notes, colored Post-it notes, what they loved and would like to change about the city. And I got about 5,000 responses. all kinds of incredible responses. Predominantly, they wanted a Primark, which was a bit countercultural. But that work ended up in the county art gallery as a massive installation. And as Damien Hirst once said, well, if it's in an art gallery, it must be art. So I was encouraged by that. And it was that project and a connection in the military that led me to go to Afghanistan as a war artist in 2011.
So funny enough, I lived in Carlisle when I worked at BBC Radio Cumbria, and I actually did like it very much. Very different, of course, from Afghanistan in many ways. How important were your military connections and the experience you had in the military when it came to being there as an artist on frontline environments?
Yeah, I think it was pretty important. I know of other people who went to Afghanistan as war artists and struggled with the kind of the military, the wariness of it. Being on patrol, for example. But I had a good sponsor, a very intelligent, thoughtful brigade commander who I knew, who wanted to take a war artist who was bringing something different to the easels and paints and even photography. And so the idea of a socially engaged art project on the front line involving these diary rooms and collecting stories was something he encouraged. And it wasn't an easy journey to get to the front because there were people in the military, particularly at say company commander and battalion level, who were hesitant about having someone come along and ask their soldiers what they really thought about being in Afghanistan, what they thought about being human there. They wondered whether it might be seditious. So those were obstacles to overcome. And, I got on the ground and the support was incredible. I set up 3 frontline diary rooms in different locations in Helmand with different British units, and then just engaged everyone I met, whether they were soldiers or civilians, British or American or Danish, asking the question, what is it like to be human here? And the kind of the central idea was 100 years on or thereabouts from the First World War and letters from the trenches. Let's do a modern day equivalent of letters from the front line or postcards from the front line in my case.
In the case of the commanders being perhaps a bit nervous in some cases, though you had encouragement in others, how about the soldiers themselves? Do they feel pretty free to speak once they were told, well, it's okay?
Yeah, they were briefed beforehand, but didn't know what to expect, really. They knew an artist was coming to spend a month with them. And when I did turn up, in spite of what they'd been told, they thought I was going to have a smock and a beret and an easel and paintbrushes, the stereotype. And when I got there and I met them and explained that I was going to be collecting their personal handwritten stories from the front line, they got it straight away, but they also thought it was funny because they thought, well, aren't we doing your work for you? And I said, yeah, exactly. And the kind of sense of painting with people kind of came up. I was facilitating, I was doing a performance artist piece in helping to build a relationship and getting their trust, which was critical. And one of them said to me, he said, well, one of the reasons why we want to help you and we want to write our story about being on the front line is that you're taking the same risks as us. And therefore you have a right to ask the question. And they took to it incredibly readily. In the middle of patrols, we would stop and they would write their story. And I noticed that, and I photographed them writing these stories. And I also saw them fight, and I kind of realized that they were writing their stories with the same intensity with which they fought, which I thought was, a powerful thing to see.
It's interesting because you did refer to the letters from the trenches, and in an age of video cameras and digital imagery, you chose to go with the written stories more than anything else. And that was interesting. Why?
Yeah, I think I'd learned through the project in Carlisle that there's something very honest and powerful and immediate that comes through handwriting that maybe you don't get in an interview to camera, where people may be a little bit self-conscious And I discovered that through the use of handwriting, we all write. We've all written since we were at school, and I found it was a very interesting way to get an honest view, to get inside people's heads, to enable people to write down their thoughts privately, but then to show them publicly. And there's nothing more powerful than reading someone's handwriting, knowing that that was written in the moment, at the front line or wherever, because it does connect you with that human person.
And Derek, you indicated it wasn't just British soldiers. How did that dynamic work with the non-Brits?
I mean, people like the Danes I worked with were, they absolutely loved it. They were very open to it and very, very, very thoughtful. I think the Americans were maybe a little bit more reserved, but I also worked with Afghanistan interpreters, soldiers and police, and any civilian that I came across, which was tricky because you're living mainly in compounds, separated from the ordinary working Afghan. But anyone I met, I asked to write their story about being human, often in their own language, in their own handwriting, translated later. And they would write about hope as well in the same way, or they would write about their families as well in exactly the same way, regardless of nationality.
You were also allowed to go out on patrol, and there was a time you actually came under fire in a firefight overnight with the Taliban attacking. Tell me about that.
I think I might have been in bed at the time, and I heard gunfire, and then I heard mortars firing off, and they were the mortars from the unit I was with. And I got out of bed, and I had a little Sony Handycam with me, and I just went to the mortar line and filmed them. And then in the dark, I just gradually worked my way up to one of the sentry boxes where there was a big 50 caliber machine gun. And I was looking out over a schoolhouse, maybe half a kilometer away. And that's where the Taliban were. They were firing rounds into our little patrol base. And we were firing back. So there was an exchange of fire. And I just filmed it. And I think, having been a soldier, you're not consciously thinking, I'm not wearing an armor vest or I'm not wearing a helmet. You're also working. So I thought, well, I need to record this as part of the context for those stories that I'm collecting. And I just filmed this firefight to the point where, artillery rounds were coming in, and I could certainly hear and feel bullets passing overhead. So it was very real. It's kind of very important for me to see that and to experience that again, because I wanted the stories to be embedded in reality. And having filmed that, I was able to provide context when the stories were exhibited.
The footage is quite dramatic, I must say. Now, how did that experience change your perspective, both as an artist and former soldier there in Afghanistan?
Yeah, it was a tricky time, I think. I mean, I wasn't there to represent any particular view. I was an official British war artist, but I wasn't being political. I was being creative in collecting these stories. It kind of made me realize that there are other human beings on the end of those guns that are firing in, and everyone has a story to tell. And we all grew up during the Northern Ireland Troubles, and it's easy just to see one side and not another. I think it's important to understand. You don't necessarily have to empathize, but you have to understand. And I think that gave me a real understanding of the other side. And just wandering around Afghanistan, being in patrols and coming across families and children and farmers, it was kind of heartbreaking in a way.
And you came back with all that material. As you quoted, if it's in an art gallery, it must be art. Who got to see the exhibition?
Well, it's interesting because I went through a censorship process, first of all, in Camp Bastion. A colonel looked through all the work, and the only thing that he took out were the names of those who'd been injured. So if a soldier's been injured, they didn't want to reveal a name, but happy to reveal those who had been killed. And other things that I thought were maybe sensitive were released. So the work was then cleared for public viewing. And the first thing that happened was that it went on show in the Ministry of Defence main building in Whitehall, because I think the army thought, well, maybe the civil servants need to see what it's really like in the front line. I thought that was a really good start point. And then it went to the Imperial War Museum. So it was, still in the war theatre. But after that, it went on exhibition in galleries. Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, for example, up in the north, is one of the Tate network of galleries. They did a very good installation of that exhibition. It toured. Parts of it went to Australia and the States. My mission in all of these things is to get these stories out there. You kind of feel privileged to be there. In my case, not painting, but collecting handwritten stories. And therefore, afterwards, the job is to get the stories out into the wider world, to get these stories out. It's never about me as an artist. It's about me trying to help get these voices heard and seen. And so I've been doing that with the Afghanistan stories ever since. And I'm still involved with a charity in the north of England that helps ex-service people into the creative arts, and I do a talk every year to them. So I'm still involved, and I still get these stories out there whenever possible.
Well, that project in Afghanistan, the success of it, led you to take that format to a very different, but perhaps equally dangerous situation over to the Himalayas and Mount Everest, where the mountaineers were preparing to climb. Now, how did that experience, having done that, the war zone in Afghanistan, compare with suddenly being up there in the Himalayas?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in people, humans in difficult and stressful and challenging situations. Before I went to Everest Base Camp, I did a project for a couple of years with Bournemouth University and their Dementia Research Institute, looking at people who live with dementia and using their stories to help reveal the truth. And so the theme of trying to understand people in challenging, complex, difficult personal circumstances is one that runs through all of my work, I think. So, going to Everest Base Camp, whilst also being a personal ambition and goal to see that environment, the chance to take this work there was pretty extraordinary. And I was supported by the British Council to go there, to take a diary room from Kathmandu up to Everest Base Camp, set up this diary room for 6 weeks, be embedded with a climbing team, mainly from India, and to live with them, and then to collect these stories from everyone who was there about, I was asking the question, and the questions are really key in these projects. You have to get the question right and the framing right so that it's very simple and it's really to the point and people understand it. And the question at Everest Base Camp is, well, what are you doing here? Why are you here? What's the driver? And, I was asking everyone there, for Sherpas and for people who worked there, it was a livelihood. For climbers from the West or from India or from Japan, they revealed incredible stories about why they were there. Often with people, there was a tragedy in the background. There'd been a bankruptcy or a marriage breakdown or a nervous breakdown or something dramatic had happened with their lives, and they were kind of trying to find themselves again in this remote and dangerous place. So those stories were incredibly real.
Derek, what were the similarities between those soldiers in Afghanistan and those climbers there in the Himalayas, both sort of contemplating danger ahead?
Yeah, I guess they were volunteers in a sense, both volunteering to be in a dangerous place. Obviously being a soldier is very different to being a sports climber or a tourist climber. But they were placing themselves in danger, and there was the anticipation of danger ahead, which drove the honesty of the stories. So the climbers I was with, and I collected about 300 different handwritten stories in my diary room tent at base camp. Those stories reflected the past and why they were there, but also a nervousness about what was to come. That was, I think, common to Afghanistan. People again talked about family, and they talked about missing home and the desire to get back to those families and to those homes one day.
And notably, some of those climbers didn't survive the climb. So I'm guessing those messages, those last words to some degree, must be particularly poignant.
Yeah, you don't think about this thing before you do a project like this. And it was the same in Afghanistan. Some of the soldiers who took part in the project wrote their own stories, went on to be killed or seriously wounded. And I've always kept in touch. I've tried to keep in touch with those families and those soldiers afterwards. And it was the same at Everest Base Camp. My own climbing team from India was involved in a high-level rescue on Everest. One of the climbers had been stranded there, and she had to be rescued from very close to the summit. But others I met and worked with and got to know and were kind of friends with also died. And there was an Australian woman who died, and she was with her husband, and it was obviously heartbreaking. But I again kept in touch. I kept in touch with the husband afterwards. I didn't want to show her story without his permission, and whether I was there working or not, those things would have happened. So I always thought, and I still think, it's better to have been there and collected their stories than not to have done so.
How did you exhibit those Everest stories then, Derek? How was it different?
It was different because the context is very different. I think I used a lot more film. I recorded a lot more film at Everest Base Camp, and so the installations had a greater film content to them. But at the center of each of those exhibitions were those handwritten stories, were those heartbreaking stories. And so the installation was shown in the UK. I took it to the US, to a mountain festival in Colorado. And again, elements of that exhibition have been seen widely, worldwide, both being covered by the international press and both being published in books as well, which again is another very good way of getting these stories out there.
That takes us to your latest project in Ukraine, Derek. At a particularly significant time in the conflict too, what did you hope or expect to learn or see on the ground there?
Well, I mean, the timing was good in many ways, with the third anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion. That was kind of coincident to the project happening. It's a project that had been discussed the previous autumn, and we'd been planning it, and then it just happened that we were there on the ground. And I think what I was keen to understand and we were keen to learn was, 3 years on from the full-scale Russian invasion, what is it that keeps you going? How do you keep going after such losses and such hardship and the relentless bombings of civilians and infrastructure that's taking place? So for me, it was to try and surface those things in a different way to what had been perhaps covered by journalism.
Well, again, you managed to get remarkable access and face those logistical challenges in a war zone. Tell us about that, getting to there.
Yeah, I was partnered up with an old friend from the Parachute Regiment, Adrian Simpson, who volunteers and runs a charity called Mission Aid for Ukraine. And for a couple of years, he's been delivering 4x4 vehicles and boats to frontline units. At great, great danger to himself to go so far forward. But what has resulted has been some wonderful relationships with those frontline units, with Marines and paras and infantry and drone units. And so the idea was to use those incredible contacts to get access. So we traveled together with an interpreter. We were delivering a vehicle, but we were delivering that right at the end of the trip. So we used that vehicle to travel through some of the major cities, but then almost circumvent the entire front line from the north front above Sumy, and then right round through Luhansk and Donetsk and round to Mykolaiv, getting as close to the front line as we could to meet up with those frontline units. So the access was extraordinary. We went through roadblock after checkpoint after roadblock, showing papers and ID, often held up for an hour. So it's very hard to get around, very close to the front line in Ukraine. But through this access and through our interpreter, it was doable. And for me as an artist wanting to get these stories, it was an incredible experience.
It occurs to me too that if people have to read the stories as opposed to kind of passively watch them, there is a more active participation in understanding what's being said.
Yeah, exactly. And these words have extraordinary power. They connect straight to the individual. And in the case of the work in Ukraine, I asked people to write their story in a slightly different way on a larger piece of paper, and then hold that to camera and to be filmed holding that. And I think what it does in this case is it connects even more strongly the story to the person. But that person who stared down the camera for maybe 15 or 20 seconds, I didn't tell them what to do, but in most cases they stared the camera down quite defiantly, which I thought was interesting. Sometimes people also smiled occasionally, but someone who saw those films early on said, "Gosh, they're quite unsettling, aren't they, as a viewer?" And I thought that's good feedback. That's exactly what we want to do. These stories are meant to unsettle, because unless they unsettle you, they won't change you, and they won't change your view.
So, Derek, let's get through some of these messages that you managed to record while in Ukraine. I mean, there's one here, filmed it in Nikopol by the Dnieper River, it's about 3 kilometers from the Russian lines. Tell me about that, the woman who was a lawyer.
Yeah, incredible and heartbreaking. I met this woman who had been a lawyer before the war, and had given up that life to set up and run a dog's home for stray and lost dogs. When it's one of the consequences of a war and invasion that we don't necessarily think about straight away. We think about people, and we think about humans fleeing away from the war, from the disaster, from the bombing, but they often leave behind their pets. And many people had fled from what is now the occupied territories and had to leave their dogs behind. They just weren't allowed to bring them. And so this woman has been rescuing these stray dogs, and she got a bit of land from the council, only a kilometer up from the Dnieper River, in full view of the Russian side, under constant daily artillery and drone range, often heard in the background. And she now has, with a group of volunteers, she's got about 300 dogs that she looks after. It's an incredible setup. And dogs are not humans, but they're pretty close. And you look into the eyes of some of these dogs who are, there was a dog that had been shot in the head. Some dogs have been blown up. Most are traumatized in some way. And so she's bringing them back to some sense of normality, and then trying to get them resettled. And so that is just one story of one person who is helping the war in her own way.
You also get a sense of how much lives have changed, because I know you had one anonymously written piece by a soldier who was actually a drone commander, drone unit commander in Sloviansk on the Donetsk front. Now, he was writing about being 14 in 2014 when the first invasion occurred. And that makes him literally just like, 20 in his early mid-20s now.
Mid-20s, yeah. And we met him just behind, maybe 10K behind the front line. We met him in his own hometown of Sloviansk, in fact. And he was the most humble, quiet, generous, quietly spoken man. But he now runs a drone team, and this is the war of the drone, clearly, and those people are critically important. And he now runs a large drone team, and he was a store manager. He ran a warehouse store before the war, and so he's obviously pretty good at organizing things. But what a contrast and what a change! And I think he wrote that he'd been near Kyiv when the invasion had happened with his own son, and had to try and escape from the Russians as they were pressing in towards Kyiv. And, that realization of doing that with his own son made him never want to have to do that again.
You also came across an artist on the streets of Kyiv, and she was very young apparently and wanted to join and fight.
Yeah, no, it's incredible to meet her. I met quite a few of the artist community, part of trying to understand what the setup is there. I certainly, didn't want to be an artist from Western Europe coming in and not connecting with the local art community. I think when we come to do the exhibitions, that collaboration with local artists and artist groups is going to be critical to the success of it and getting the word out there. And we met her in a cafe in Kyiv.
People around motivate me most. When I see how brave and great-hearted they are, I can't run away or just sit. I try to do my best too.
She knew people who lost their homes. She was young. She wanted to help. She felt she wasn't doing enough. She wanted to go and fight, but she thought, well, there are people better able to do that than me at the moment. And if conscription changes, if the age range changes, then she will certainly go. And she was like she was wonderful, but fragile, and you wondered how that was going to work out for her.
Many people obviously contribute their own way. There's one story that was interesting of the artist who paints portraits and then donates the money to the military.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, there's a group of artists in Kyiv who do this, portrait for donation. And I met them, and I had my own portrait painted, and I donated. And these are people. These are three women. Their husbands, their partners are all fighting, and I think they are, maybe as artists we often struggle to think how we can help, and how to make our work meaningful and important and relevant. And they had found out how to do that by raising money through these portraits, and writing about it, and then holding it up in the streets of Kyiv, almost a million miles from the front line, but very connected to that front line.
Let's look at a few more of the stories and messages you got there on the front lines too, Derek. Now, the sense of loss, personal loss, comes across in one of the ones you had of a soldier standing by a vehicle that had been destroyed by a Russian drone, and he's got a picture of his fallen comrade, his friend, actually on his phone.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So, again, not choreographing it too much. I let people decide what to do in front of camera when they were holding their story. In his case, uniquely, he got his phone out and showed a photograph of a comrade who I learned had been killed recently, and as I was filming, he spoke about that comrade, and whilst I'm not necessarily including the sound from these films in the final work, the fact that he's speaking to camera and showing something, a photograph of a dead colleague, I think is powerful enough.
People suffer a lot without the power generation and stuff. And there's one you have of a soldier standing in the snow at a village near Izium, which was largely destroyed by the Russians, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'd met him previously in Kyiv, and then we met up again on the outskirts of Kharkiv, and then traveled down to this particular place. And he was very keen to show us where the fighting had been at its most intense in 2022, when they were pushing the Russians back out. And we stopped in this village, and I filmed him. He said, "You can't walk any further than where the vehicles were, because there were minefields still." And this village was deserted, entirely empty, and they'd fought and recaptured it from the Russians, but then the Russians had shelled it and destroyed it as they retreated. And he wanted to show that. And in his story, he says that he never trusted the Russians, would never trust them.
I think one of the things that comes through in many cases in a conflict is how ordinary people's lives are changed. And I know you had one soldier, and many of them are obviously, they weren't soldiers before they started fighting, but they see the loss of the civilian population. There was that block of flats that was bombed by a Russian airstrike. It was hit by a Russian airstrike in March of 2022, and there was about 50 civilians, including children and elderly people, killed in that. And the soldiers there, written anonymously though.
Yeah, I think he wrote about the fact that if he doesn't fight, then his wife will die and his son will die. And that's a really stark, it's a very bleak and stark thing. But, if you give anyone on this planet a reason to fight, that would be the strongest reason. And that together with that background of that building just completely torn apart by a Russian airstrike is, it's profound and it's powerful, and it's the image and the story together, is something that will help change perceptions and change views of this conflict at the human level, I hope.
Talking of that human level, the fact that people have to get on with their lives and still try to add to their value to the conflict, came across that female medic you filmed in Kramatorsk, who had just 3 months earlier lost her son.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that at first, and she was with another colleague who was a medic, and we met them both and talked to them both, and then they wrote their stories, and then I filmed them holding their stories in Kramatorsk.
I am here so that Russia won't come to my home. I want to live in a free country.
And her colleague said to me afterwards, he said, "Oh, she has only just lost her son who joined up, who was 21 and who'd been killed by the Russians." And it was interesting because she didn't particularly want to write about that. I think it was too near, too painful, but you could see it in her. And when I found that out, I personally I found that quite emotional. There were a few moments in this trip and in this project which emotionally affected me, and that was one of the key ones. And I just wanted to give her a hug, which I did.
What's been your response to what you saw, not just as an artist, but also as a former soldier, to what you saw and the people you met in Ukraine?
I mean, it is an incredible thing to visit a country at war. It's a very different experience to Afghanistan, which is more of an insurgency type operation. But in Ukraine, you have a sense from the moment you enter the country that this is an entire country at war. Every city I was in was attacked by drones and had sirens going off at night. When I was in Kyiv, a Russian drone struck a building 200 yards round the corner, and many people were injured. And there was the constant sound of anti-drone guns and so on. But when you get closer to the front line, it's a very surreal experience of every single vehicle you see is there for the war effort in some way. And many of the vehicles have anti-drone technology on the roof to defeat drone attacks. We obviously didn't, so that was a little bit of a worry for us. But going forward to meet those forward units and also to meet civilians in the big cities, the overriding sense you have is, yes, it's a country at war, but it's a country incredibly steeled and determined. It's a people who won't willingly give up.
Considering the state of war you've just described, entirely present in the country, what sense did you get that people are hopeful that there will be peace soon?
It's interesting. A lot of people talked about peace, and when we engaged them as part of the art project, they wrote about peace. They wrote about the need for peace for themselves and their families and their friends. There's a desperate yearning for peace. But when you talk to them, there's also a strong sense that peace will not be at any price. So the numbers are disputable on both sides in terms of killed and injured. That they haven't been fully revealed, but it's a great many on both sides. Enormous numbers of Ukrainians have died and been killed in the war or by shelling, and also what happened prior to the full-scale invasion. So because that's happened, I got a strong sense that this is a nation and a people who don't want to willingly give up and have fought for nothing.
So they wouldn't want to give up land to Russia for peace, it seems.
I think not. That is my sense. And the soldiers I met, they said, we definitely don't want to give up our land. This is our homeland, our motherland, or however they described it. And the blood of their soldiers is in the ground, and it's not something they want to just give up to an invader.
What did you learn about what the people there thought of President Zelensky and President Trump?
Yeah, it was interesting. There are figures out which kind of reveal the real perception, but I got a strong sense on the ground that the tide was turning, probably in both ways. There was a sense beforehand that Zelensky was not as popular as he'd been, and also a sense beforehand that Trump was quite popular. And when I was there, the tide was turning, and I think it has turned. Zelensky is now incredibly popular there now, in the sense that they believe he's fighting for their cause, not necessarily agreeing with some of the tactics, but agreeing with the strategy of fighting for that country and giving it all. And also a sense strongly that maybe Trump isn't there for them, or a realization that he isn't there for them. And one of the soldiers said to me, and he wrote about this, he said, well, it doesn't matter what Trump says, it won't affect how far my anti-tank gun can fire. And the reality on the ground is very separate to the political debate taking place at a high level, but people are nervous.
And of course, what we saw happen in the White House between President Zelensky and Trump was not exactly the best thing for the people of Ukraine to see as a reassurance, I guess. Did you at least were giving their voices a platform by documenting their stories? Do you think people feel in general that their voices are being heard?
There's certainly a lot of coverage, and it obviously comes and goes with whatever's happening in the world. And obviously, we're all consumed by tariffs and trade. So the public gaze does shift, but inevitably it will come back to Ukraine. There has been enormous coverage by the media. I just wonder whether at an individual level, people feel they have been heard. That was one of my senses, and I think one of the reasons I felt that was because of the willingness to engage with this project. No one said, I don't want to take part. Everyone wrote their hearts out. Everyone wrote with a great honesty and integrity about how they felt. So I don't think it's possible to get to a point where you've exhausted those voices. They still need to be heard.
Freedom still matters. One day I would love to lie in a bed without having nightmares, without sweating and calming my hands down. And that's it. But we must take responsibility for everyone who fought before us, yesterday or 100 years ago, because we will be here forever. It's always a choice to get up and continue doing your own thing, where everything is filled with meaning, because some have sacrificed the most for those meanings. Freedom still matters.
I think one of the most important things in this discussion we should think about, Derek, is the fact all these stories you tell, whether it be Afghanistan, Everest, or Ukraine, or anywhere else you go, they're only a fraction of the huge, the massive stories that are actually out there. And this is a sampling. It just shows how much there is to tell. So you potentially have a lot on your plate.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it is only a sample, but I'd like to think it's a representative sample. If you asked another 1,000 people, you'd get variations of the same, and so it's a bit like kind of Me Too, really. That could be my story, that could be your story, that could be anyone's story in that conflict, and therefore it is universal, and therefore it's relevant.
I think it's the idea that so many people are affected is what I'm getting at.
Yes. Yeah, the scale is incredible.
Taking that into account, Derek, and considering the connections you make when you're out there in these environments on the front line, whether it be at Everest, Afghanistan, Ukraine, do you feel you have a duty to represent their voices?
Well, I do very much so. It's a bit like if you're a painter, you want your work to be seen. I mean, it can be terrifying to have your work seen, and for me, it is the most important thing, that the stories that were given in the moment, they were given freely and willingly, built on a short relationship of trust. I'm compelled to get these stories out there. I think that's why the stories were written. They were written to be seen, and my role is, without question, to get them out there in whatever way possible.
They have to evoke an emotion, yeah. Tell me about your future exhibition plans, Derek.
Well, having only just returned recently, I've only been back less than a month. I think before we went, the idea was to collect the work, and then plan the exhibition schedule, the installation, put it together in whatever form that would be. And whilst we were in Ukraine, we visited some galleries. We connected with some people in the art sector in Kharkiv and in Kyiv. And I've also got connections in the gallery and art world in the UK and Europe. So the idea was to put together an exhibition and then to show that. But the realization when we got back that takes time, and we're at a critical moment, a real crux with Ukraine at the moment, and unsure of which way it will go. So the sense very strongly was that these stories need to be seen now, and obviously doing this with you is a wonderful way to do that and to begin that journey of getting these stories out there. And I think the exhibitions will follow, but let's not wait for the exhibitions. Let's get the word out there as soon as possible.
Well, let's look ahead too, Derek. And what would be the next project in your mind? I mean, would Gaza, for example, be like the ultimate?
Gosh, I think Gaza would be the ultimate. I mean, it's heartbreaking, and obviously there's been the recent, the killing of aid workers in Gaza, which is a real controversy. There's an untold story there somewhere. There are voices which aren't being heard in Gaza in a non-political sense, just human voices, and of those families and those young people and those older people who have no involvement at all in the politics of it, who just want to exist. There are also issues around immigration. Globally, it is an issue, and it's an issue in the West. And I live in the Netherlands, and it's clearly an issue here. So that is also something which greatly interests me, the human story of immigration and migration. I think the Gaza thing would be incredible. It's again how to get access. I'm confident that if I was on the ground, I could get the stories, but it's how to get the access, and I'm open to suggestions.
Well, I know whatever you choose to do next, Derek, you will definitely evoke some thought with your style of artistry, if you like. Thank you very much for taking the time with us. It was really good to hear the stories.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Riz.
That's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments and thoughts. From me and the team, thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time. But we leave you with a few more of the memorable accounts from the front line, documented by Derek Eland.
Every single person is supposed to have their thought and the right to have a free life. Master Sergeant RVP, Fire Support Platoon. I want to be free. I just want to live.
My strongest motivation is people around me. Living in Kharkiv, you start valuing your life more than ever. And so do people around you. Despite all the explosions and threat from Russia, we continue with our lives, wipe the dust from coffee tables in the destroyed coffee shop, play music, and enjoy our lives.
I'm a junior sergeant and have been in this war since the first day of full-scale invasion of Russia Federation. My family and I were under occupation in the first day, and that's what encouraged me to protect my family and motherland. We have been defending Donetsk, Kharkiv and Sumy regions with my battalion since the first day of the war. I must stay together with my brothers in arms until our victory, so our families can sleep peacefully and wake up without the fear of bombing, so our children can live in the free and best country in the world, our Ukraine.